I'm joined by experienced lockdown sufferer, Gideon Rozner. Gideon, thanks so much for your time tonight. Now, talking point number one.
Great to be here, Corey.
A study published on July 21 in the medical journal The Lancet indicated that government lockdowns were ineffective. Researchers collected data from the 50 countries with the most cases. They found lockdowns were not associated with mortality reductions in critical COVID-19 cases, although factors such as obesity, smoking, and life expectancy were. Why do they do it, Gideon?
Well, why indeed? And The Lancet isn't the only study to show that lockdowns are ineffective. I think there are about 7 high-quality peer-reviewed studies showing the same thing. But, Corey, we don't even need the studies. Common sense, and I'm a medical layman, but if you look at the statistics, there is no correlation between lockdowns and COVID deaths. Peru has the highest amount of COVID deaths per capita in the world right now, and it went into lockdown on March 16th, a very severe one. So you can't accuse them of locking down too late. By contrast, Burundi, a small, poor country in Africa without much of a health system, the president there famously refused to cancel things like large sporting events and political rallies, and they have had the third lowest amount of COVID deaths per capita. And then there are examples like the UK versus Sweden. There is the example of New York, where they had lockdowns and more COVID deaths than freedom-loving Florida. So there is absolutely no correlation whatsoever between lockdowns and preventing COVID deaths. None at all.
Gideon, I think you're the first person in the history of television to hold Burundi up as the benchmark for the rest of the world. Congratulations. It's
freedom-loving Burundi.
New level of expertise. Who would have thought? Well, as you said, there are other studies. It's Frontiers in Public Health studied 160 countries, this time testing numerous factors such as public health, demographics, government policy, economy and environment to determine how each correlated with COVID-19 mortality. And they concluded stringency of the measures settled to fight pandemia, including lockdowns, did not appear to be linked with death rates. So if these studies are showing this, Gideon, why are the governments in this country, who should be better informed than they are, persisting with this lockdown mania?
It's a good question, Corey, because up until the coronavirus outbreak, lockdowns were never contemplated really by any credible epidemiologist anywhere ever. In fact, as late as October 2019, just a few months before the outbreak, even the WHO, the brains trust that is the WHO, the World Health Organization, said lockdowns are not recommended in any circumstances. What changed was that when the Wuhan outbreak occurred possibly after the lab leak, Xi Jinping imposed lockdowns, and they were based not on any, actual epidemiological advice, but on his personal philosophy of Feng Kong, which is basically health security. The same philosophy, by the way, that he's used to justify the quarantine of 1 million Uyghur Muslims because on the basis they're infected with extremism. Now, what happened then was that China broadcast images to the world via social media of people being welded into their apartment buildings in the city of Wuhan. And unfortunately for us, instead of Western leaders looking at this and saying, oh my God, that's terrible, it would never happen in a free country, they actually said to themselves, well, gee, that looks like a pretty good idea, we better do that too.
Yeah, it's one of those things, Gideon, where I think governments were so caught on the hop, not knowing what to do given the conflicting information, that the appearance of doing something substantive and justifying it through a scare campaign and a fear campaign proved that they were showing leadership, and now they've got no other arrows in their quiver. It's very disappointing. But it's not just this lack of health response, though. Talking point number 3. The results of Europe's lockdown experiment are in. That's a study that found that countries with harsher lockdowns suffered more economically. Nations with lengthy, stringent lockdowns, like Italy, for example, performed the worst, while Sweden's economy remained essentially flat while allowing citizens to largely go about life as normal. Gideon, do you remember when Sweden was going to be the international pariah and it was just basically going to be wiped out because of COVID-19 and their refusal to lock down? But it's proved to be a pretty smart play so far, hasn't it?
Yes, well, as I said, Sweden in the end had fewer COVID deaths than the UK, Spain, France and all sorts of other countries that had very stringent lockdowns indeed. But that's a great point. But Corey, again, we don't need an economic study to tell us that shutting down businesses en masse will destroy an economy. That's basic common sense. What worries me even more than that, though, is that governments seem to be under this impression that they can defy the laws of fiscal and economic reality by effectively spending their way out of the damage that they cause. Now, when has any human civilization ever in world history paid people en masse not to work, paid businesses en masse not to trade? So we have a situation in which more money is being thrown into the economy, less is being produced. This is creating a very, very unstable dynamic. And as bad as things are in Australia right now after all these lockdowns, I fear that it'll look like a golden age compared to what's coming. That is the real hangover of what we have done, and that is where the real misery and deprivation and despair will come in when those economic problems come to fruition.
It's like a day of reckoning, Gideon, in the sense that at the moment we've got the hundreds of billions of dollars that the government splashed and threw into the economy. That is sloshing around. We had a lot of pent-up demand. People are out there flashing the cash if they can and having a good time, hitting the bars and the restaurants. But at some point, reality's got to hit. The government can't continue to throw tens of billions of dollars into the economy every single year. People have to get back to work. You can't pay people to do nothing, otherwise they will do nothing.
Correct.
And the day of reckoning, I reckon, it's got to be coming, doesn't it?
Yep, absolutely. I think it is. And look, as we said a little while ago on your show, Corey, it's time to be looking at inflation-proof assets like Bitcoin.
Oh, that's another conversation altogether. But, this show's been pretty good on the money, and you've been pretty smart about picking the issues well ahead of time, Gideon. So now, talking point number 4. Large studies that assess people's mental health before and during COVID-19 have actually reported marked increases in anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, I should say, since the pandemic began. It is essentially, Gideon, the hidden pandemic, the damage we are doing to people, which could take years, maybe decades, or they may never recover from the actions of the last 12 or 15 months.
No, they might not. And Corey, this is the most sickening thing about all this is the public health brigade that for years have been telling us, with a good point in many respects, about things like the mental health crisis, about the loneliness epidemic, about how much more we have to spend on Medicare rebates for psychology and so on and so forth. They obviously do not care, or they see it as a smaller order issue when they cause this kind of despair en masse. They don't care about the mental health consequences that come from prolonged periods of isolation. They don't care about the fact that children as young as 12 have been put on antidepressants during the course of this lockdown, and they don't seem to care about the other physical health problems that have arose from this lockdown. The missed cancer screenings, for one thing. What happens to your body if you're locked inside your house for 23 hours a day and you can only go walking outside in fresh air for 1 hour? The fact that we had a baby die in utero because the poor mother of this unborn child couldn't get across the border for urgent medical treatment. The fact that we had 4 babies die in South Australia because they couldn't be airlifted to Melbourne for cardiac surgery. The singular focus on the technocratic business of case numbers and rolling averages and exposure sites as if the building is haunted. They cannot see, these public health bureaucrats and unfortunately the politicians who are backing them in, the very real health consequences that are unfolding before our eyes. And I think it's time, and I've said this on Twitter this week, I think it's time after all this is over for somebody on behalf of the broader political class to offer up a national apology to the Australian people for the crimes against Australians that have been committed during this awful, awful coronavirus saga.
Yeah, the damage is incalculable, and of course they'll tell us they've saved us from ruin by their actions, but in reality I think they've done the opposite. Gideon Rozner, love your work at the IPA and with The Spectator, and I love you joining me on Bernardi every Friday night. Thanks so much for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thanks so much, Corey.